Welcome back to the deep dive. We often get source material that reads like history or cultural studies, things like
Right. Analyzing trends, events.
exactly. But sometimes a listener sends us something that, well, it feels like it's trying to lay out the fundamental operating system of reality itself.
Whoa, okay. Big picture stuff.
Very big picture. Today, we are deep diving into an exceptionally dense and honestly fascinating piece of comparative theology. We're looking at what might be the ultimate foundational juxtaposition, the first Adam, and the figure who is often referred to as the last Adam, or the Christ figure.
Yeah, this source sounds less like a commentary and more like a systematic blueprint. It really functions like a philosophical proof almost.
Oh, so.
Well, it uses the failures described in the original creation narrative, Adam's fall, primarily not as, just mistakes or unfortunate events.
Which is how we usually think of it.
Right. Instead, it frames them as essential, divinely ordained steps toward a finalized, perfect creation. It's like a double entry ledger for existence, you could say. Every deficit in the first column, Adam's column, is redeemed and perfected in the second, the last Adam's column.
That concept right there, that failure is essential. That's what really grabbed my attention. It flips the script entirely.
It does.
So I think the core mission for us today is to methodically unpack this theological comparison. We need to go beyond just retelling the stories and try to understand the mechanics the source claims are at play.
Okay.
How do concepts like creaturely free will, divine foreknowledge, which, as you noted, the source seems to use almost interchangeably with predestination,
Yeah, it does.
and this idea of the absolute necessity of suffering and, frankly, catastrophic failure. How do all those pieces supposedly harmonize to guarantee the ultimate perfection of the entire created order?
Because that's at the heart of it. We are diving into the very purpose of existence, as presented here, and the specific mechanism by which spiritual and moral perfection is ultimately secured.
And the source gives us a framework for this.
It does. It argues that the story of the first Adam serves as a type or a shadow. The original text uses a term implying a preliminary sketch, maybe a representation. It suggests Adam's entire life trajectory was designed, in a way, to prefigure the eventual perfect fulfillment found in the last Adam's life, and crucially, his sacrifice.
Okay, so a type or shadow.
Yeah.
It sets up an unavoidable question right at the start, doesn't it? Was the first Adam just, destined to fail, programmed for it? Or was his story simply the most, efficient way to get the necessary components for the real plan into place?
That's the tension we need to explore. The source walks a fine line there.
All right, let's start breaking it down. Let's dive into section 1. The structural similarities and differences laid out in this comparative framework.
Okay. So the comparison kicks off by establishing the primary relationship for both figures. It frames both Adams in the context of a profound, defining union, essentially, a marriage.
Right, and it starts with the most familiar reference point, Genesis. The first Adam is defined by his choice to leave his original state. You could say leaving his parents in the sense of immediate divine proximity to unite with his wife, the woman.
It's the formation of the primal earthly household, that fundamental human unit.
Exactly, and the source immediately mirrors this with the last Adam.
It does. The son, in order to fulfill his redemptive role, leaves the father's side, that eternal original state of being, to marry the bride.
And the bride, in this theology, specifically refers to the church, right?
Correct. Specifically the church. So in both cases, the foundational move is an act of separation from the original source, followed by a binding union with a chosen partner. This initial parallel sets up the symmetry. Both figures are defined by love leading to union.
Okay, so far so symmetrical. But that symmetry breaks down pretty quickly when we look at what happens next, the immediate consequences of that union.
Dramatically so. The first Adam's union with the woman leads directly, almost inevitably it seems, to the catastrophic temptation and the fall. The woman eats from the tree of knowledge.
And then gives it to Adam. But when we look at the last Adam, the source presents the situation very differently, doesn't it? His bride, the church.
Yeah, the bride is described as already being dead, or perhaps more accurately, as having already eaten the fruit, having already fallen before the last Adam even arrives on the scene in this specific capacity.
That distinction feels huge.
It's paramount. The first Adam confronts the test when the possibility of sin is, let's say, live and active in the moment. He's right there when the temptation happens.
You've got a front row seat.
Exactly. The last Adam, however, enters the picture when the failure is already a historical fact. The damage is done, the sin is manifest in his bride.
And how do they respond? The first Adam fails to overcome his devotion, or maybe the source implies it's a misplaced love. for the woman.
Right, and he willingly eats the fruit alongside her. He chooses solidarity and disobedience.
He makes that choice. He chooses her over the command. Now contrast that with the last Adam's moment of temptation.
Well, the last Adam overcomes the temptation through a critical act of submission. The source points specifically to that profound scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, Luke 22:42, where he confronts the ultimate test.
Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me.
Yet not my will, but yours be done. He prays, asking for the cup, representing suffering, separation to pass, but crucially, he submits to the Father's will. He successfully resists the temptation to choose his own comfort or his own will over the divine plan.
Which is the very failure Adam committed in Eden, choosing the partner's path over the Father's command.
Precisely, and their respective consequences then demonstrate the full inversion of the narrative. For the first Adam, the direct result is that he faces death because of the woman. That's the immediate consequence linked to his choice.
And not only that, his immediate reaction afterwards is, well, it's very human, isn't it?
Yeah.
Deflection. He blames her.
The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. Exactly. His failure is followed by this lapse in moral integrity, prioritizing self-preservation, shifting the blame.
Whereas the last Adam
Stands as the perfect antithesis. He dies, yes, but he does so deliberately, specifically bearing the bride's sin. He chooses the ultimate deflection, you might say, the deflection of consequence by taking it entirely upon himself.
he deliberately chooses to be forsaken by the Father in her place.
Yes. It's the moment where flawed human self-preservation is completely replaced by perfect divine substitution.
This whole substitutionary dynamic, the source argues, extends even into the spiritual architecture, maybe, the
Yeah.
creation of the helper herself.
Right, back in Genesis, the first Adam is put into a deep sleep, and the woman is formed from his rib. It's an extraction, requires this temporary deep slumber, which you could see as a kind of metaphorical death, a vulnerability.
Okay, I see the parallel building. So for the last Adam,
The parallel is breathtakingly specific in the source. For the last Adam, his spirit departs on the cross. It's a definitive, irreversible death. And the church, the bride, is then established and formed figuratively by his blood.
explicitly tied in tradition and theology to the water and blood that flowed from his side after death on the cross.
Precisely. So in both cases, the spouse is created, in a sense, out of the physical sacrifice or vulnerability of the male figure. But one is a temporary procedure resulting from sleep, and the other is a final atoning act resulting from death.
So you have the prototype, the first Adam who fails, the source suggests, due to misplaced love, leading to blame and death for his own sin.
And on the other hand, the perfected archetype, the last Adam, who succeeds through sacrificial substitutionary love leading to redemption, taking on the bride's sin.
But the source insists they're linked by a singular, powerful motivation underneath it all.
Yes, and that link is devotion to the spouse, to the partner. The argument is quite profound here. It says the first Adam loved his spouse unto death.
Unto death, meaning he accepted the fate of eating the fruit and facing the consequence of death right alongside her, because he chose union with her over obedience to the Creator.
That's the interpretation offered.
Okay, I have to pause here, because framed that way, it sounds almost heroic,
Yeah.
doesn't it? A tragic hero. If he chose his wife over the command, knowing the cost, accepting death for that choice, you could almost frame it as a noble, albeit flawed, act of love.
You could, and I think that's part of the complexity the source highlights. Both were motivated by love for the spouse, a love that went unto death.
So if both loved the spouse unto death, what makes the last Adam's love perfect and the first Adam's flawed, according to this theological framework?
That is the essential theological pivot point. It's the reason for the death and the nature of the love. The last Adam loves his bride, the church, by giving himself up for her without having committed the sin himself. His love is presented as pure, untainted, substitutionary sacrifice. The crucial difference lies in why they died. The first Adam died due to his own sin. A sin motivated by love for his wife. Yes, the source acknowledges that, but still a direct violation of the divine command he received.
He broke the rule himself.
He broke the rule himself. The last Adam died solely due to the bride's sin. He remained personally sinless, yet took the consequence that belonged to her.
Okay, so the first Adam's love, though costly, was inextricably mixed with what the source implies is idolatry loving the creature more than the Creator. His act pulled both down.
Exactly. And the last Adam's love, equally costly, was untainted by personal sin and therefore purely redemptive. It lifts the bride up. It's the difference perhaps between a shared suicide pact, tragically motivated by love, and a true rescue operation, motivated by perfect love.
That's a stark contrast.
It is. The flawed love guarantees death for both participants eventually, but the perfect love guarantees life for the beloved, the one rescued. And this distinction really sets the stage for our next section, where we need to drill down into the original purpose of that first partner in Eden. What was the helper actually supposed to do?
Right, this section forces us to reread that part of Genesis, not just as a, lovely origin story about companionship, but maybe more like a strategic planning document for facing a serious cosmic threat.
Yeah, we often forget the immediate timeline presented in Genesis 2. God commands Adam not to eat the fruit. The test is explicitly established. The terms are set. The garden is under this moral contract.
The rule is clear.
Very clear. And immediately afterward, right after the command is given, God states, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him."
So the creation of the helper isn't just an afterthought about loneliness. It's presented as a direct response to the existence of the moral test.
That's exactly how the source interprets it, which means the helper wasn't just intended as a companion for, leisure or procreation, the things we often associate with marriage.
She was a strategic asset.
Precisely. Created specifically, according to this view, to help Adam win the test of the tree of knowledge.
Wow, okay. So how is she supposed to help?
Well, the source emphasizes that Adam was put in the garden to work it and take care of it, or sometimes translated as to keep and protect it. The implication is they were meant to be a combined defensive unit.
Working together to maintain obedience.
Yes. To ensure perpetual obedience against whatever external pressure, like the serpent, or even internal pressure, might try to compromise the garden's integrity, its adherence to the command.
So the fall, in this light, isn't just a simple lapse in judgment by one or two individuals. It's a strategic failure of partnership. The defensive unit failed.
It's framed exactly as a strategic failure. But then the source goes further and analyzes Adam's choice of partner. And this is where the critique of the first Adam's judgment becomes extraordinarily sharp.
What do you mean? God made the woman. How did Adam choose?
Well, remember, Adam first surveyed the animals. God brought them to him to see what he would name them. And the text says, "But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. He assessed the available options, found them wanting."
Okay. He participated in the search process.
He did. And then God creates the woman from his rib. Adam's response is immediate joy. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." He accepted her, named her, and embraced her as his partner.
That sounds positive, right? The recognition of a true counterpart.
It does sound positive. But here comes the profound, almost cynical critique from the source material.
Okay, what is it?
The source argues that Adam made a fundamental error right there in prioritizing the creature, even this perfectly matched creature. The ultimate critique leveled is that Adam should not have chosen the woman as his helper. He should have chosen God as his helper.
Wait, choose God as his helper. How does that even work practically? God made the woman for him.
It's a challenging statement. The source suggests that when faced with a moral crisis of that magnitude, the only truly sufficient, truly reliable helper is the Creator himself, the source of all life, truth, and strength. By choosing a creature, no matter how beautiful, how intimately connected, how perfectly formed, Adam prioritized a lesser and ultimately, as events proved, a fallible source of strength and counsel.
That is a fascinating and very stark hypothetical. How would that have looked? What would choosing God as his helper have meant in the moment of temptation if the woman came to him with the fruit?
The source implies it wouldn't have been about rejecting the woman as a person, but about prioritizing the ultimate authority in the crisis. It means if the woman had come to him with the fruit, or perhaps if the serpent had tempted him directly, choosing God would have meant immediately turning to God, perhaps in prayer, perhaps by quoting the command back, reaffirming his loyalty first to the Creator before engaging with the temptation presented by the creature.
So, making the relationship with the Creator the absolute non-negotiable priority in that critical moment. Preempting the temptation by anchoring himself in God rather than in his relationship with the woman.
That seems to be the idea, appealing directly to the divine mandate and divine help, rather than getting drawn into the flawed reasoning presented by the partner or the serpent.
And yet, we know he didn't do that. And perhaps, as the source seems to pivot later, maybe he couldn't have truly chosen God in that way, not until something fundamental changed within him. But before we get to that necessary flaw, let's look at the result described here. The first helper failed in her role. She didn't help win, she facilitated the enemy's victory.
He did. And the contrast is then drawn sharply with the last Adam's bride, the church, as the evidence of redemption and transformation.
How so?
The church, the bride, is described as resurrected, spiritually transformed, and crucially, she overcomes the tree of knowledge test through the Son's victory. She is no longer the source or cause of the fall. She is now the redeemed, perfected instrument of God's purpose.
So she transforms from, essentially, a point of failure into a primary witness. What does that witness role entail in this framework? What is she witnessing to?
She serves as the living proof, the tangible evidence of the truth of God's commandments and the ultimate power and perfection of the cross. She then actively helps the bridegroom, the last Adam, prepare the path for the final judgment.
Not just by being saved herself, but by actively participating.
Yes, by actively demonstrating through her transformed existence that obedience, perfect love, and irreversible righteousness are possible through the work of the last Adam. She becomes, in a sense, part of the evidence against the accuser, a spiritual force whose very existence confirms the enemy's ultimate defeat.
So the failed partnership that introduced sin into the world is remade through the last Adam into the perfected partnership that assists in the final destruction of sin and death itself.
That's the trajectory laid out, from failed helper to perfected, witnessing bride.
But this incredible transformation hinges entirely on what the source portrays as the inherent fragility, the built-in weakness of the first Adam's original state. Why was his free will so fundamentally prone to failure? And why, according to the source, was that catastrophic collapse apparently a prerequisite for the perfected outcome? This feels like where we enter the really dense, philosophical, almost paradoxical territory.
Yes, exactly. And here is where the source delivers perhaps its most challenging, maybe even controversial premise. It defines free will, specifically creaturely free will, the kind Adam had, as inherently and definitionally the possibility of sin.
Okay, wait, let's slow down there. That's not the standard definition most of us probably work with. We often think of free will as, moral neutrality. The scales are balanced and that we can tip them either way.
Right, like a capacity for good or evil.
Yeah, but this source is saying the very existence of choice for a created being is itself an inherent structural flaw, or at least carries an inherent risk.
That's the interpretation presented. To be created, to be finite, and yet to possess moral agency, the ability to choose, means you inherently carry the structural capacity to choose wrongly. It's built into the system of being a creature with choice.
Wow, okay.
And here is the core and frankly terrifying logical implication the source draws from that premise. If the possibility of sin remains at even, let's say, 1%, just a tiny fraction.
Been given enough time.
Exactly. Given enough time, especially an infinite or near infinite amount of time, the creature will eventually sin. It becomes a statistical certainty.
Over an infinite timeline, a 1% chance isn't just a chance, it's a guarantee. So if a creature is potentially immortal and their free will is described as incomplete, meaning they still retain that tiny possibility of failure, then their eventual fall isn't just a risk, it's a certainty baked into their very nature.
It's presented as a guaranteed outcome of an incomplete system. The source uses an analogy almost like, imagine you have a machine designed to run forever, but it has a tiny, minuscule flaw in its design. Eventually, over eons, that flaw will cause the machine to break down.
And applied to morality.
Applied to morality, this means any creature with this kind of incomplete free will is already fundamentally dead in principle, even if they haven't actually sinned yet. Their current actions might be perfect, but their structure guarantees future failure.
That is a heavy concept. The source actually says those who has not yet died but are certain to die eventually are, in the grand scheme, all dead.
Yes, that's a direct concept from the source material. It applies this principle to Adam before he ate the fruit. He was dead in potential because his free will structure wasn't yet permanently secured against failure.
And it applies universally, even to beings we might think of as perfect, like, say, the angels. What about the angels who didn't fall? The ones who resisted Hillel or Lucifer's temptation?
Yes, according to this specific source, it applies even to them. It clearly states that the loyal angel's free will is still incomplete.
Even after they pass their test.
Even after. While they won their initial test of loyalty against the rebellion, the source argues that if they were left in that state indefinitely, without a further perfecting mechanism, they too would eventually sin, just like Adam inevitably did. Their success proved their loyalty then, but it didn't fundamentally change the structure of their creaturely free will. It didn't eradicate that 1% possibility.
So holding a pristine moral record, even passing a major cosmic test, doesn't solve the underlying structural integrity problem. The creature remains fundamentally risky, vulnerable, until that tiny possibility of failure is completely and permanently eradicated.
Correct. Which leads us directly to the counterfactual scenario the source explores. Why wasn't simply winning the test enough for Adam?
Right. Let's imagine Adam had successfully resisted Eve, resisted the serpent, obeyed the command regarding the tree of knowledge. What then?
The source does grant that his path forward would likely have been significantly less painful. His process toward ultimate completion, whatever that looked like, might have occurred without suffering, or with much less suffering. It might have resembled the path of the loyal angel's confirmation through obedience, perhaps.
So a smoother ride. But why couldn't God just say, okay, you passed the test, congratulations, here's your permanent perfection? Why wasn't winning sufficient to achieve that final, irreversible state?
Because, according to this framework, resisting temptation is only a proof of temporary loyalty or correct choice in that moment. It's not, in itself, a guarantee of eternal, irreversible perfection. His free will, even after winning, would still have been incomplete in the source's terms. It would still carry that latent 1% risk. The creature would perpetually remain in what the source calls a dangerous state.
It sounds like the highest moral achievement for a creature, in this view, isn't simply consistent obedience, but achieving a state where they are permanently incapable of disobedience.
That's exactly it. The goal isn't just choosing right repeatedly, it's reaching a state where choosing wrong is no longer even a possibility within your nature. And that permanent inability, the completion, the extinguishing of the very possibility of sin is achieved, the source argues, only through one specific powerful mechanism.
Let me guess. The cross.
It's a cross. The ultimate, visible, tangible demonstration of God's perfect love, the consequences of sin, and the power of sacrifice. The cross, according to this framework, is the only event potent enough, transformative enough, to fundamentally alter the creature's free will structure, sealing it forever, removing that residual possibility of sin, doubt, and future rebellion.
Wow. Okay. This radically shifts the perspective on the fall, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It moves it from being an unfortunate mistake, a tragedy that derailed Plan A, to being a necessary, maybe even intended component of the only plan that could lead to this kind of ultimate perfection. It makes the path through failure seem unavoidable.
The source is absolutely resolute on this point. It states plainly, the cross perfects creation. And Adam's specific sin, his failure with the tree of knowledge, is presented as the necessary prerequisite that establishes the need for and enables the installation of the cross within the created order, within human history.
So back to the counterfactual. If Adam had successfully navigated that initial temptation in Eden, what would have happened to the cross? Would it still have been necessary?
The source suggests that if Adam had won, the cross, as we understand it, could not have been set up in the same way. The entire creation process, the structure of history as we know it, and the specific means of human completion would have had to be fundamentally different to achieve that same result of irreversible moral perfection.
So Adam's failure wasn't just a way to get to the cross, it was the specific historical trigger required for this particular divine plan to unfold.
That's the argument. His failure was the mechanism that brought the ultimate solution, the cross, into the fabric of human history. And the source draws a distinction here between the completion paths for angels versus for Adam, or humanity.
Right, you mentioned the angels resisted temptation. How was their path to completion different?
They only needed to witness and confirm the truth revealed by the cross and the first resurrection, the source says. By affirming that ultimate demonstration of love and power, their already proven loyalty could be solidified into irreversible perfection, apparently without needing to personally endure the kind of suffering humans experience.
But Adam, representing humanity, having actually failed the test,
requires physical suffering. The struggles, the hardships, the pain inherent in the fallen world become the specific process through which his and humanity's free will is completed. This suffering acts like a refining fire, breaking the creature's bond with the principle of sin.
So the pain isn't just a punishment.
Not just punishment. It's presented as a necessary, albeit painful, process that seals the deal, confirming the choice for God and against sin, making it permanent. It's the suffering endured in the physical realm that becomes necessary, in this view, for humanity to cease sinning permanently and have that 1% possibility eradicated.
So suffering, in this specific theological context, isn't merely a consequence of past failure. It is the necessary, painful means by which the creature's freedom is secured for eternity. It allows the permanent removal of that potential for collapse.
That's the difficult but central argument being made.
But Okay, if this failure was so essential, so necessary for the plan, then where does Adam's actual choice fit in? Was he truly free to choose in that moment in the garden, or was his path completely predetermined by this need for the cross? This brings us right into the thick of Section 4, dealing with foreknowledge and grace.
Yes, this section directly tackles that immense classic theological tension between divine sovereignty, God's overarching plan, and genuine human agency or choice. And the source begins with a very firm statement on God's side of the equation,
Which is?
that God predetermined that creation would ultimately be completed through the cross. This plan wasn't a reaction. It was fixed before the ages, established in the eternal counsels of God before anything was even created.
Okay, if the end goal and the mechanism completion via the cross were locked in from before time began, then Adam's choice to fail, which the source says triggered the necessity of the cross. Well, it seems like that failure had to be absolutely guaranteed by the time history unfolded, right? Doesn't that just obliterate any sense of genuine choice for Adam?
It certainly creates a fascinating and potentially troubling philosophical scenario. The source is completely clear on the certainty of the divine plan's outcome. Therefore, it addresses that exact question. What if Adam, somehow defying the certainty of this predetermined course, had chosen to win?
Yeah, what then? If the cross must happen, but Adam obeys.
God would have had to intervene radically. The source presents it as basically two options God would have had in that hypothetical situation.
Option one.
Option one, God would have had to somehow change the entire creation process to accommodate Adam's success, while still finding some other way to establish the cross's necessity and achieve the same kind of irreversible perfection. A total rewrite of the cosmic script, essentially.
Okay, massive divine adjustment. And option two.
Option two is even more startling, perhaps. The source suggests God would have simply placed another creature, one who would inevitably fail under the conditions, into the position designated as the first Adam.
Whoa. So if this Adam had succeeded, God would have swapped him out for someone guaranteed to fail just to ensure the predetermined plan unfolded.
That is the staggering implication presented. It suggests that the specific identity of the individual creature, Adam himself, was ultimately subservient to the required outcome. The failure was a necessary function, a required step in the cosmic timeline, and the creature who occupied the role of the first Adam was, in a sense, filling a pre-written slot that demanded failure for the larger plan to proceed.
That speaks volumes about the priority given to the divine plan here. The structural outcome of the perfection of all creation via the cross is the absolute priority, seemingly overriding the individual's historical path if necessary.
It does seem to prioritize the end goal. The individual's genuine temporal experience of choice is maintained within their own timeline, but the ultimate result of that collective history is secured by the Creator's overarching plan and purpose.
But how can the plan be secured so absolutely without fundamentally violating the structure of free will itself, which we just established is defined as the possibility of sin, the possibility of choosing otherwise?
The source's answer seems to lie in its understanding of the nature of the divine presence and God's relationship to time itself. It emphasizes that God exists simultaneously in all time.
Not just looking forward into time.
No, not just foreseeing it like watching a movie reel. God is not bound by the chronological sequence of the created order. For God, the past, present, and future exist concurrently, simultaneously within the divine reality.
So God doesn't just predict the future completion via the cross. God experiences and sustains every moment of history, including the beginning and the end, all at once.
Exactly. From the divine perspective, the future completion via the cross isn't just a high probability or a plan. It is an existing certain fact within God's eternal experience. God resides simultaneously, as it were, before creation began and after creation is completed.
So while Adam, within his own limited linear experience of time, genuinely feels he is making a choice.
The ultimate fixed point on the map of reality, the cross, and the resulting completion, is already a present reality for God, making the overall path certain, even if the individual steps feel contingent to the creature taking them.
Okay, let's bring this back down to the garden then. Given this framework of a predetermined outcome necessitating failure, was Adam truly capable of obeying the command not to eat the fruit? Could he have actually chosen God as his helper?
The source firmly asserts, yes, Adam was capable of obeying the external command. It insists that the commandments are not too difficult to keep.
How can that be if failure was necessary?
Because, the source argues, creatures can obey specific commands, even before the cross. because God always grants sufficient grace and only allows tests that are actually manageable. We see the proof of this, the source points out, with the loyal angels. They successfully won their test against Hillel's rebellion because God provided the necessary grace and limited the difficulty of the temptation to a level they could withstand.
So Adam's failure wasn't due to an insurmountable lack of physical or mental capacity to say no in that moment.
Correct. It wasn't that the test was inherently impossible. Rather, as we discussed earlier, it's framed as a fundamental motivational error, a condition of the heart that was already present. Adam could have chosen God, could have fled to him, could have resisted the external act. He had the capacity.
The internal.
Internally, the source adds a critical nuance. While Adam could have obeyed the command externally, he could not have kept the law perfectly in the heart, meaning he couldn't achieve that perfect internal love-driven obedience purely from his own resources at that stage.
Why not?
Because that level of perfect, internal, heart-level love and obedience requires the completed demonstration of God's love on the cross to fully enable it in the creature.
Okay, so the standard is different at different stages. The degree of required obedience, or perhaps the type of obedience possible, is tied to the amount of grace available and the structure of creation at that specific time.
Precisely. Before the cross, perfect internal love, the kind that makes sin impossible, was structurally unavailable to the creature, according to this view. But external, transactional obedience to a clear command was possible?
Adam was capable of saying no to the fruit.
Yes. But he was already operating from a place of misplaced love, an internal idol. He loved Eve more than God, which the source suggests made him already dead, internally, even before the bite. The external sin, eating the fruit, merely exposed the internal, pre-existing failure of love and priority.
Which then sets up the critical purpose of the cross, beyond just forgiving that act. It's about final separation and securing eternal freedom.
Exactly. The cross, as the ultimate demonstration of perfect love and the ultimate consequence of sin, serves as a great divider for the entire created order. It fundamentally separates those who accept God's completed love, a love which, when accepted, fundamentally changes them and eliminates the possibility of future sin from those who ultimately reject that love.
And what happens, according to the source, to those who reject the love demonstrated on the cross, those who refuse that transformation?
Because their primary motivation remains self-gratification, self-will, they cannot truly love God or keep the commandments from the heart. Consequently, the source argues, they inevitably continue to harm their neighbors, to oppress, to exploit.
And if God were to allow these eternally rebellious, oppressive individuals to persist forever in the finally perfected creation,
They would destroy its peace and integrity. They would continue to inflict harm on others.
so the final judgment, which is often described in stark terms like God throwing the rejectors into the lake of fire. The source frames this not as, say, arbitrary vengeance, but as a necessary act of cosmic protection.
Absolutely. It states it is done to protect those who are oppressed by them. This framing confirms a key tenet running through the source. God ultimately does not violate the free will of those who definitively choose to continue in sin and self-gratification, even if that final settled choice leads to their own destruction and separation.
Their final destructive choice is, in a grim way, honored, and their removal guarantees the safety, peace, and perfection of the remaining creation. The system is structurally secured against future disruption.
That's the picture painted.
Okay, the logical structure holds together within its own premises. Adam's failure was necessary to introduce the cross. The cross, in turn, perfects creation by transforming willing recipients, eliminating the possibility of future sin in them, and separating out those who refuse, thereby guaranteeing the eternal safety of the redeemed. But let's bring it all the way back to Adam's personal journey one last time.
Right. We absolutely have to revisit the core paradox one last time. Why did the sin, the catastrophic failure, have to happen for Adam himself, and by extension the bride he represents, to achieve this ultimate completion? We've established the source's surprising claim. The first Adam was already spiritually dead before he even ate the fruit.
Because his heart was already in the wrong place. He had internally chosen the woman, the creature, over God, the Creator. His motivation, the very source of his agency, was already fractured. He was serving an idol, essentially.
Exactly. The external act, eating the fruit, was just the inevitable manifestation, the symptom of that pre-existing internal idolatry.
So if he was already dead inside, then the fall itself, the act of eating the forbidden fruit, wasn't necessary to make him sinful.
No, not to make him sinful fundamentally, but rather it was necessary to expose his true state to himself. He needed to be confronted by the stark reality, the undeniable consequence of his own internal choice so that he could finally realize he was dead, spiritually bankrupt.
This realization of his own poverty, his wretchedness, his spiritual death, that's the crucial first step.
It's presented as the absolutely necessary first step towards seeking the true source of life. He had to see his need before he would seek the supply.
You know, this sounds precisely like the concept articulated elsewhere in Christian theology, particularly by Paul, where the law functions as a kind of harsh tutor, a pedagogos. It doesn't actually save us, but its demands reveal our utter incapacity to meet them, thereby driving us in desperation to Christ, the one who can.
That's a very apt parallel. In this Edenic context, the tree of knowledge functions similarly. It doesn't provide life. Instead, by presenting a command that Adam, due to his internal state, ultimately breaks, it reveals the sin problem already residing in his heart. This revelation, this failure, is what eventually drives him, or those represented by him, towards the tree of life, towards Christ.
Without realizing their profound spiritual need, their poverty, their failure, their deadest creatures will simply never abandon their self-reliance, their trust in other creatures, or their own efforts.
And they won't seek the genuine permanent helper. God himself revealed ultimately in the last Adam. The sin, the failure with the tree, was like the light that had to be switched on to expose the pre-existing darkness in Adam's heart.
Okay, so once Adam, representing the incomplete bride, recognizes this wretched dead state, how does this figure finally achieve the transformation into the true helper, the perfected bride?
The first Adam, who symbolizes the incomplete and fallen bride, is spiritually reborn, regenerated through the work of the last Adam, the Son. This transformation is presented as fundamental, radical. It allows the bride to become the true helper, the suitable partner, who now actively assists the Son in the final stages of completing creation.
Doing what specifically?
Assisting in the definitive elimination of sin and death. She is no longer a strategic liability causing the fall. She is now a perfected asset contributing to the final victory.
So the role itself, helper, is restored, but the object of her service, her allegiance, is fundamentally shifted and elevated.
Exactly. She shifts from primarily serving the first Adam, the temporary, flawed partner who led them both into sin, to serving the last Adam, the eternal bridegroom who rescues her from sin.
And the source gets specific about this new partnership.
It does. It details this refined partnership by stating that the bride now serves not only the last Adam, the bridegroom, but also the two advocates, or comforters. It explicitly names Christ as the first advocate, representing his work on earth and intercession, and the Holy Spirit as the second advocate, representing the ongoing presence and power of God within the believer and the church.
So the church, the perfected bride, assists this unified divine administration, Father, Son, Spirit, in the work of finalizing creation. That's a radical elevation of her status and spiritual authority compared to the original dynamic in Eden.
It certainly portrays a much higher calling and function in the completed order.
And this final transformation, achieved through the last Adam and acceptance of his work, is what finally guarantees the structural integrity that was missing at the beginning. It solves the 1% problem.
Absolutely, that's the ultimate outcome. Through this process, realizing deadness, turning to the last Adam, being reborn, receiving the advocates, and accepting the sacrificial love demonstrated on the cross, the very possibility of sin is permanently eliminated from the creature's nature.
That inherent 1% risk of collapse is finally gone. 0% chance of failure.
0%. This is the ultimate security feature, the guarantee that ensures eternal life. It secures the creature in a state of irreversible, perfect righteousness, incapable of falling again.
But the philosophical question still lingers, even here at the end. If Adam knew the command, couldn't he theoretically have just bypassed the woman's suggestion, ignored the serpent, and chosen God as his helper from the very start, avoided the whole mess?
The text suggests, subtly perhaps, a profound psychological or spiritual barrier. It implies Adam could not have truly bypassed the woman and chosen God as his ultimate heart-level helper until he understood practically and experientially the reality of his own failure and his own spiritual deadness.
Knowledge, or maybe self-knowledge, had to precede true commitment.
It seems so. Just as the law reveals sin by demanding performance and highlighting the shortfall, the tree of knowledge, by being the focal point of the failure, was necessary to reveal Adam's core condition, his misplaced devotion, his internal idolatry. Only by facing the devastating consequences of that choice, by truly experiencing a spiritual death, would Adam and humanity finally, permanently, and irreversibly seek the true, permanent, divine helper. The pain, The failure itself was necessary for the depth of perception required for permanent change.
It's an incredibly intricate intellectual structure relying heavily on paradox. It demands that the creature achieves ultimate perfection through the experience of utter failure.
And that, in essence, really summarizes the entire challenging but fascinating deep dive we've taken into the source material. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, this has been an extraordinarily rigorous exploration, really digging deep into the theological structure, or at least a theological structure, underlying creation, fall, and redemption. Let's try to briefly recap the core takeaways that you, our listener, might want to internalize or wrestle with from this specific source material.
Absolutely. I think the first and maybe the most counterintuitive insight is this. The first Adam's failure wasn't presented here as just an unfortunate accident or plan B. It was framed as a necessary, perhaps even planned component required to establish the ultimate redemptive mechanism, the cross within the fabric of created order and human history.
Right, without that specific failure, the unique completion process designed for humanity, involving the cross, simply could not have been enacted in the way it was.
Second, there's that startling redefinition of creaturely freedom. Free will, for any finite being, inherently contains the potential for sin. It's not neutral, it's risky.
And that potential, that tiny 1% risk over an infinite timeline, translates into the mathematical certainty of eventual failure unless something intervenes.
Exactly. Therefore, the only way presented here to achieve true, permanent, irreversible freedom from the possibility of sinning is through the mechanism of the cross, which alone can fundamentally alter the creature's nature and eliminate that possibility forever.
And finally, that complex interplay between choice and destiny. God's foreknowledge, which the source equates with God's simultaneous existence across all of time, guaranteed the ultimate path to completion. The plan for perfection via the cross was fixed before creation even began.
Meaning Adam's role, including his failure, was secured within this predetermination, ensuring that the ultimate solution, the cross, would be installed in human history exactly when and how it was needed to perfect the universe according to this specific divine strategy.
It really forces us to entirely reevaluate how we might define moral integrity or completion. It suggests it's not primarily defined by a pristine record, by somehow avoiding all mistakes.
But perhaps by the irreversible sacrificial commitment that is secured after the mistake, after the failure has painfully exposed the true condition of the heart and the creature's absolute need for divine rescue.
Which leaves us with this final, quite provocative thought to ponder.
If the ultimate foundation of eternal life and irreversible good character, according to this theological framework, requires the visible, costly demonstration of sacrificial love via the cross, a demonstration necessitated by failure, what does that imply about the necessary role of suffering, failure, and particularly the realization of our own profound incapacity in our own individual journeys toward genuine completion? It suggests, quite powerfully, that the greatest moments of pain, the times when we are forced to confront our own spiritual deadness, our failures, our limitations, these might not be detours from the path to perfection, but potentially the essential mechanism itself, the very process that strips away self-reliance and seals our journey toward genuine, irreversible moral completion. It's the pain, the confrontation with our own weakness and failure that, in this view, truly seals the deal for achieving eternal strength and security in God.
A very profound and perhaps challenging thought to consider as you reflect on the potential, even necessary purpose of failure in the grand scheme of things. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thank you. It was a fascinating source to explore.